Let's talk about the United Kingdom. On one hand, you've got London, one of the most powerful financial centers on the entire planet. But on the other hand, you have an economy that some are saying is starting to look like the first major economy to, well, to deindustrialize. So how can both of those things be true at the same time? We're going to unpack the story of how one single event kicked off a chain reaction that's been building for more than a decade.
To really get this paradox, you have to start with this number, $652 billion. That's the economic output of London. Just London. I mean, if London were its own country, its economy would be bigger than Sweden's or Argentina's. It is, without a doubt, an absolute global powerhouse. But here's where the picture gets really, really stark. You can see it on the map. London and the southeast of England, that area has about a third of the UK's population, but it generates almost half of the entire country's economic output. And that right there creates the central tension of this whole story. It's a tale of two Britons, one that's thriving and one that's really struggling to keep up.
Okay, so here's our game plan for this explainer. We'll start with that tale of two Britons. Then we're going to trace it all back to the first domino that fell in 2008. From there, we'll dive into the lost decade, a cascade of crises, the strange mystery of the missing workforce, and finally we'll ask the big question, is the UK economy really on life support?
Every story has a starting point, right? Well, for the UK's current economic woes, that beginning was the 2008 global financial crisis. Now, this wasn't just a bump in the road. It was the first domino in a very, very long line. And the way the UK government decided to handle it, well, that set everything else in motion.
Look, every developed country got hit hard by the 2008 crisis, but the UK's response really set it apart. After bailing out its banks, to the tune of £141 billion, by the way, the government got scared of a debt crisis. So, it chose a path of austerity. That means deep cuts to public spending, instead of investing in things to stimulate the economy, like job creation programs or tax cuts.
And that single decision, it had massive consequences. It kicked off what economists now call the lost decade. For the next 10 years, the UK economy basically just flatlined. So let's take a look at what that actually meant for the average person living there. So, the most important thing here is how this hit people's wallets. You've got to understand this term, real disposable income. It's basically your take-home pay, right? The money you have left over after taxes and everything to actually live on. And for almost 15 years in Britain, it just stopped growing. Think about that. The cost of living kept going up, but people's ability to pay for it just didn't.
And you can see the result crystal clear right here. If you go back to 2007, the average British family was about 6% less well off than their American counterparts. Now, look at how that gap has just ballooned to 16% today. And it's the exact same story when you compare them to countries like Norway. Living standards in the UK didn't just stall, they fell way, way behind their peers.
Now, the other side of this coin is something called productivity, which is just a fancy way of measuring how efficiently a country works. Before 2008, it was growing at a pretty healthy 2% a year. But after the crisis and that big turn towards austerity, investment from both businesses and the government just dried up. And the result? Productivity growth completely collapsed to almost zero, leaving the UK with the second lowest rate in the entire G7.
So, picture this. You have an economy that's already weak, already fragile, after a decade of going nowhere. And then, it gets hit by not one, not two, but three massive back-to-back shocks. It's a perfect storm. First up, 2016, Brexit. All the uncertainty around it caused foreign investment to plunge by a quarter. Then, just as things were starting to settle, bam, the COVID-19 pandemic hits, forcing the government to borrow another £280 billion. And finally, the war in Ukraine sends energy prices through the roof, triggering a massive cost of living crisis for everyone.
Okay, so to deal with the pandemic and the energy crisis, the government had to borrow huge sums of money. But here's the catch. Most of that borrowing happened when interest rates were basically zero. Then, to fight the inflation caused by that energy crisis, central banks had to jack up those rates, making all that new debt suddenly way more expensive to pay back.
And the cost is just staggering. This number, £100 billion, is the UK's new annual bill just for the interest on its debt. That's an increase of £60 billion a year. To put that in perspective, that's almost the same as the country's entire defense budget. An entire defense budget now spent just on interest payments.
These huge economic numbers can start to feel a little abstract, but they have very real consequences for real people. And one of the most puzzling has been what happened to the UK's workforce.
This is truly strange. After the COVID lockdowns ended, every other major advanced economy saw its workforce bounce back. People went back to work. But Britain is the one weird exception. Its workforce never got back to pre-pandemic levels, and that's created these massive ripple effects on everything from tax revenue to economic growth.
So where did all the workers go? I mean, the official unemployment number is low, but that's hiding the real story. The government has this official term, economically inactive, and it applies to a massive group of 9.4 million people who aren't even looking for a job.
So who are these 9.4 million people? Well, you can see the breakdown here. About 2.1 million are students, and another million are at home taking care of family. But the biggest, and frankly most concerning group is this one, 3.5 million people, many of them over 50, who've left the workforce completely because of long-term sickness or because they just decided to retire early.
Now, if you add the economically inactive to the people who are officially unemployed, you get to nearly 11 million people who are out of the workforce. So you have to ask the critical question for the whole economy. With a labor shortage that big, who's going to fill all the jobs?
Well, the government's answer was to change immigration policy to bring in more workers for key industries. A large wave of migrant workers, especially from outside the EU, came to fill these critical jobs. And while that was economically necessary to keep services like the health system running, this rapid demographic change has also, become a pretty intense source of political debate.
All right, so when you put all these pieces of the puzzle together, the austerity, the stagnation, that triple shock, and the workforce crisis, what's the final prognosis for the UK economy? Where does that leave us?
So let's just quickly run through that chain of events again. It all kicked off with the 2008 crisis and that fateful choice of austerity. That directly led to a decade of stagnant wages and zero productivity growth. The unhappiness that caused then fueled a massive political break with Brexit, which in turn weakened the economy just before it got slammed by the compounding shocks of a pandemic and a war, landing us in today's workforce and debt crisis. See? One domino after another.
When analysts summed up the whole situation with this really stark quote, they said that until things really turn around, the UK risks functioning like a developing economy that just happens to be attached to the global financial hub of London.
But, it's important to keep this in perspective. London is still one of the most innovative and wealthy cities on Earth. And history shows us that national economies go in cycles. They have highs and lows. Things can, and eventually they will, get better.
But for right now, the UK story is one of a long, complicated chain reaction, where one crisis just keeps triggering another, and another, and another. And that leaves us with one final, lingering question to think about. In this long line of dominoes, what falls next?
Do like and subscribe US Briefly.